So, Gavin Barwell, thank you ever so much for joining us today. So in a career of yours which has spanned everything really from ward councillor in Croydon up to housing minister and then chief of staff for the Prime Minister, you were Minister of State for Housing for just under a year, but I always kind of get the sense that you really enjoyed that, perhaps more than other kind of ministerial jobs at that level. What is it about housing that kind of you got the bug for?
So I think it's a personal passion and has been ever since I got involved in politics. Actually, years ago when I was just fresh out of university, my second job was as a political advisor in what was the old Department of the Environment on housing and local government policy. So it's something I'd always been interested in all the way through my political career, and the constituency I represent, Croydon in South London, was one where there were some profound housing issues. So when you get appointed as a minister, the Prime Minister calls you into the cabinet room and says, I'd like you to join the government. And it's a complete lottery what you're going to get. You know, they could have made me Minister for the Arts and it would have been a total disaster. But I just got very lucky. Maybe someone in number 10 knew I had this kind of backstory in housing, or maybe I just got completely lucky. But I was put in what was the perfect job for me.
Do you think it's kind of underrated a bit in that world of different jobs when they're being divvied out? And why is that?
So when I was Chief of Staff, I had a go at trying to persuade the PM and the sort of the civil service secretariat behind her to make housing a cabinet level job. So obviously it sits in this, well, at the time it was called Communities Local Government. Now it's Levelling Up Housing and Communities, but it sits in this department alongside local government policy, regen policy, some other issues. And I always think that's a shame, because the other great public services, health, education, transport, they have their own departments. Whereas the Minister for Housing job is just below cabinet level. It's one of the most senior of what they call the Minister of State.
Is that just a vanity, or does it mean something in terms of public policy?
It would mean there was less turnover, I think. You know, when you get, if you look at Secretary of State for, I mean, there's been a lot of turnover in everything over the last 6 months, but if you set the recent chaos aside, you tend, if you get made Secretary of State for Education or Secretary of State for Health, you tend to do that job for 2.5 years at least, sometimes longer. But because the Minister for Housing job is just below cabinet, Prime Ministers often use it as a stepping stone job. They put someone there that they think is good, that they think they might want to bring into the cabinet, and then when a vacancy appears, they often then get pulled out of it. We've just seen it happen with Lucy Fraser.
Yeah, so I looked it up last night actually. So what, you've ceased being housing minister in 2017. Do you know how many housing ministers have been since then?
If I was going to guess, 8 or 9.
Yeah, 10. 10.
Right.
Alok Sharma, Dominic Raab, Kit Malthouse, Esther McVeigh, Chris Pincher, Stuart Andrew, Marcus Jones, Lee Rowley, Lucy Fraser and Rachel McLean. Average time in the job?
Well, rough calculation must be 6 months.
Yeah, seven months. Like, why? It takes longer than 7 months to build a house. Like, why is this?
So obviously the recent period has been completely exceptional, because we've burned through quite a few prime ministers in that time as well.
That's true.
And so every time you change the person at the top, you're reshuffling the whole pack. But even if you discarded that, if you looked from me and went back to, say, 2010 when David Cameron came in, you would still see roughly every year and a half a changeover. Yeah. And I think it's this kind of stepping stone nature of the job that's the problem. If you could make it a full Secretary of State position, you'd still, politics is always a degree of turnover, but it wouldn't be as bad as it has been. And it's not good for policy. I mean, one of the things I've learned, I learned it a bit in the job as housing minister, and definitely since I've left politics and I'm now working advising businesses, is that business basically just wants stability. I remember one person saying to me when I was housing minister, I would rather you had a bad policy and just stuck with it than you made 5 or 6 changes and eventually ended up with a good one. Stability is almost the most important thing. So this turnover is actually, it's not just sort of silly, it's actually damaging in policy terms.
I mean, I know colleagues in the housing sector who now, when there's a new housing minister, they think, just copy and paste the last letter we sent welcoming the new one, because it, like you say, it becomes so difficult. So tell me about the practical day-to-day of being a housing minister. What does it actually look like? What comes across your desk? Where do you feel like you've got real influence?
So I've come into the office about 6:30 in the morning. You've got a big in-tray that will be made up of 3 things. There'll be policy submissions where the officials are asking for your view on a policy issue. There'll be casework. So I was the planning minister as well as the housing minister. So you've got actual planning applications that have been called in by the government that you're taking the decision on in a kind of quasi-judicial function.
Can you give me an example?
So what will happen in a controversial planning matter is either the government will say this is a big one, we're going to pull this in, or sometimes the MP might lobby the government and say, I don't think my local council's getting this right, I'd like you to take a look at this. So they're not you trying to build an extension. Yeah. They're bigger things than that. But they're ones where the government has basically said, we're going to take this off the local planning committee and make this decision. And obviously they're big folders. There's a lot of detail in there that you've got to wade through. And then there's correspondence. Lots of people write to ministers, and some people get a reply from officials, but lots will come from the minister. So it's a big in tray you're wading through. You're working with the Secretary of State to try and come to an agreement between you about where you want to go with housing policy. And then quite a bit of your time, once you've made those decisions, is trying to get the rest of the government squared off, get what's called collective agreement to that policy. So that's a big part of the work. And then finally, you've got all of the sort of parliament-facing bit where you're being rightly held to account for what the government is doing on housing policy, answering questions, taking part in debates in the Commons. And
then when you went on to work as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, I mean, how much time does a Prime Minister spend thinking about housing? And I don't say this in a derogatory way, because I appreciate there's a lot of stuff going on, but is it once a day, is it once a week, is it once a month?
So I don't think you can sort of say once, that's not quite how it works, but not a lot. I mean, I think if you talk to any Prime Minister, nearly all of them have become Prime Minister because they're passionate about domestic policy. Whether that's housing or education or health or the economy or whatever, that's the thing that motivated them to come into politics and motivated them to want to be Prime Minister. They get in there, half of their time is taken up with foreign affairs. Yeah. They just get sucked into, they are ultimately the head of the government, and they have to do all the relations with the US President, Putin, Xi, NATO, EU when we were in it, Commonwealth, G7, G20, all of these things, COP, right? That takes up a huge chunk of their time. In Theresa's case, when I was there, she had even less time for the domestic stuff because she had this Gordian knot of Brexit to try and unravel, and that probably took up over half her time. She did think about housing because actually it was one of the issues she felt very passionately about doing something about, so we did eke out time to look at those housing issues, but I can't tell you it was a significant chunk of her time.
But when they do get involved in it, do they kind of engage in the detail, or do they rely very heavily on their ministers and advisors? Or
so they definitely rely on whoever they've appointed as the minister and their kind of core advisors in number 10. But they will get down into normally when the Prime Minister's getting involved, it's because something's not right, the policy's not working right. So you do need to get into that detail to understand what's the problem. In her case, if you remember, one of the things she was really passionate about was to get the country building council housing again. She wanted to increase the overall supply of housing, and she wanted to build more homes of every kind of tenure. And she passionately believed we never get up to the sort of 300,000 homes a year that we wanted to build unless we got councils as well as housing associations, as well as big developers, small developers, build to rent. You want all of those people involved in the game to get the numbers that we needed. So they don't get involved in every decision, obviously they can't, but if there's something that they think is not right and it needs their involvement to kind of kickstart it, that's when they tend to get involved.
So one of the really big things that she did do as Prime Minister was the removal of the HRA borrowing cap.
Yes.
Of course. Can you tell us a bit, I mean, how did that come about as policy? How was it decided? What level of involvement does it have?
I had a little bit of involvement. I mean, obviously I'd been the housing minister.
Thought you might do, yeah.
And I had a little bit of unfinished business, I suppose, the things that we'd not been able to get into the white paper or that had not been implemented. But you were pushing an open door because she was interested in this issue. She'd actually been very supportive when we'd been doing the white paper. I think there was quite a shift in housing policy from David Cameron to Theresa. Mm-hmm. So that tells you something about her kind of personal passion for the issue. But the thing you had to get over was the Treasury. It didn't want to do it. Because if you look at it from the Treasury's point of view, if you take the cap off, you're potentially allowing local authorities to borrow more money. You can't quantify exactly how much more money, and the Treasury is all about trying to control how much the government state is spending, how much money the state is borrowing. So they took a lot of convincing that this wasn't a sort of big open door that was going to allow huge amounts of extra borrowing. And we were like, okay, well, there will be some extra, but local authorities are limited on what they can do based on the assets they have. So that was the sort of battle that the Prime Minister was involved in, convincing the Treasury that this was the right thing to do. And did influence by the housing sector play any role in that? I ask it because I think a lot of people spend a lot of time, understandably, trying to influence government policy. And so I suppose my question really is to them, how should they go about it? How would they do that successfully to see that kind of... So when I was Housing Minister, I think that the housing association sector in particular had an outstanding advocate in the shape of David Orr. When you're minister, a load of people come knocking on your door and trying to get you to persuade you to do something or the other. And most of them, if I'm honest, are a little bit tin-eared. They just come in and say, we would like this. And they explain why, from their point of view, that's what they would like to see happen. David was quite canny in that he would look at what ministers had said in their speeches, and he would come in and say, I see that you're trying to do X, and let me tell you how we could help you achieve X. And nearly always it was what the sector would have wanted anyway, but he'd found some way to make it sound like he'd come in to help you achieve what you wanted to achieve. So I thought he was a really effective advocate for the sector. And actually, I think, I'm testing my memory now because it's a few years ago, but I think towards the end of Teresa's time as Prime Minister, she went and spoke at the NHF annual conference.
She did, yeah.
That was a mark, I think, of the influence that the sector had with government and with Number 10, essentially.
So I think one of the things that good advocacy does well is it's non-party political in that kind of sense. And it seems to me there's a bit of a cross-political consensus around housing, but you're always going to kind of get one side that says just put more money into it and it will solve the problem. Do you think it is a case of just put more money into it, or is there more?
More money would definitely help. We could definitely do with spending some more money on housing. But I think I would say two other things, which is it's not just about money, and I'll come back to that in a second. And to the extent that it is about money, it's also about what you spend the money on. So let's take those two in turn. As well as the money, I would argue that you need to make some changes to the planning system. And you also need to think, what can we do as a country to get some more people into the business of house building? You know, we've made a bit of progress in recent years getting some of the build to rent sector, you know, from that wasn't delivering anything 10, 15 years ago. It's now making a contribution. But can we look at some of the major house builders in other countries and say, would you like to come here to the UK and start adding, you know, we need more people building homes in this country. So I think market reform, planning reform, so it's not just about money. But on the money front, you know, if you looked at the totality of what we spend on housing, we spend a lot of money on housing benefit, universal credit. Yeah. Are we spending that money really effectively?
It's going to be my next question. So 16 billion a year on housing benefit, 3 billion a year, roughly 3.5 on building new affordable houses.
Feels
It's totally the wrong way around.
Feels the wrong way around.
Yeah.
We're basically just subsidising landlords each year.
Yeah.
Through the welfare system, rather than actually trying to solve the underlying problem through bricks and mortar. And then I would also say to you, and I can understand why we did this, you know, we were doing it when I was the minister, so I'm not condemning it, but we spent a lot of money on Help to Buy. Now, short term, that's helping people who wanted to get their own home and were struggling to afford it. It's helping them. And, you know, it was also probably an important intervention when the housing market was really struggling. But there is a danger with those kind of demand-led subsidy schemes that actually all you're doing is fueling the market a bit further and pushing prices up.
Yeah, and it seems sometimes that the state is doing the exact opposite of what it kind of encourages individuals to do. I mean, never forget once knocking on a door, I was in Tower Hamlets, talking to somebody who was they were clearly on housing benefit in a private rented house, but this house was clearly ex-local authority, been bought under right to buy. So someone's bought that at a huge subsidy off the state and then let it back to the state at inflated prices, and the state is then paying the private rent. It seems like madness.
Yeah, so to me, you know, I'm very much in favour of giving people discounts to buy homes, but there are some interesting caveats that I think you need to apply to that. So one is you need to make sure that the money that you get in provides replacement rented stock, which we haven't completely done with right to buy. And secondly, we maybe need to look at what you can do when you go on, you know, because when that happened with right to buy, that individual gets all of the discount, and then it doesn't get circulated back around, right? Whereas if you look at some of the community-led housing schemes now, they will say, you know, we're selling you this home at a discount, but when you sell it on, you can only sell it at a multiple of local wages. So you guarantee that home remains affordable. You know, you've put some subsidy in to get the price down to an affordable level to sell originally, but you want to then guarantee that as it's sold on over time, it remains affordable. So I think those are the kind of things that we need to think about.
I know the London Community Land Trust in Mile End and in South London links it to wages, so it goes up with wage inflation rather than house price inflation.
So that you kind of know that that's forever going to be an affordable local home in that community. Then you can see some merit in that, I think.
So can I ask you, and there's no reason that, you know, your brand of conservatism should take second place to the chap I'm about to mention, but I've heard Jacob Rees-Mogg describe social housing as like, why are we building tower blocks for Labour voters? And why as a Conservative do you care about this? What's the self-interest and the and the kind of the politically right thing to do from a conservative perspective on housing?
So, first of all, I'd reject the suggestion that the automatic assumption that everybody that lives in social housing is going to vote Labour. You know, that's a weird attitude for the Conservative, and it's sort of self-fulfilling if you're basically saying, well, we're not even going to try and win votes from those people. And, you know, Jacob would separately talk about the Red Wall and how the Conservative Party is doing better among working class voters. So it's weird to, those two things are in conflict with each other. But even if you said to me, most people that live in social housing are not going to vote Conservative, I'd still be in favour of building it, because the government has got to have an answer to people that can't afford to own. I mean, I always thought this was a completely false argument. So personally, I'm all in favour of encouraging ownership. I think a society where lots of people own capital is a fairer society, and the gap between rich and poor will be less as a result. But you have to recognise that A, some people are not going to be able to afford to do that, and B, some of the people who are going to be able to afford to do it, they can't do it at 21 when they first start working. So you've got to have decent, affordable, secure housing for those people to live in as well. A proper one nation Conservative government should be saying, we're trying to provide for everybody. We're trying to provide decent housing options for everybody, and that's got to involve a mix of tenures.
I just want to touch finally on Grenfell, because it's such a tragic and monumental moment in the history of housing in this country. I suppose my question really is, not in an accusatory way, but I know you've been part of the discussions around this. How does something like that happen, and how do we stop it from happening again?
So the inquiry has to answer that question. I mean, I think it's clear that there are multiple things that have gone wrong here, but the government has to take some responsibility, and ministers like me that served in the government have to take some responsibility. You know, I spent a day giving evidence to the inquiry, and I took that responsibility very, very seriously. You know, because I wanted to make sure that the people that lost loved ones and people who had life-changing injuries, they deserve to know the truth of what happened. So I gave the evidence to the best of my ability about what I had done, where I think with hindsight I would have done something differently. I don't want to say too much, because I don't think it's right for me to try and prejudge the result of the inquiry. That wouldn't be right. But I think there are some things that are clear that we can say, which was, you know, there was a failure in the building control system. The government had a degree of confidence in how that system was working that it shouldn't have had. And also there's clear evidence that we've already seen at the inquiry that beyond that failure, some individual businesses were doing things that they knew weren't consistent with the rules that were in place. So I think when you get a tragedy like this, there are always multiple things that have gone wrong. The fact that it is thankfully such a rare event, you know, if it had been something that was common across multiple buildings, you would have had multiple of these incidents. So there are a number of different causes. But in terms of public policy, government has to take its share of responsibility. And I think if you look at the department's closing statement to the last round of the inquiry, the government has accepted that. And I think that was the right thing to do. And I think all of the senior officials and ministers that were involved at that time have to take that approach. And you know, it's important that we get to the truth so that we make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I think certainly looking at what is coming out of government at the moment, it will at least have some sort of legacy in terms of, you know, people who put up the cladding can't also be responsible for regulating what kind of cladding goes on there in the first place, and those kind of changes need to happen.
I think also, you know, listening to the views of people that live in social housing. So there's the building control issue that we've touched on, the regulatory piece, but there's also a sort of respect issue that I think has come out of it. The social housing green paper, the white paper, the legislation, the changes to regulation that are going on with an increased focus on, you know, the customer essentially and the customer voice. So I think there are multiple changes that we you know, nothing that we do can bring back people that lost their lives, but we owe it to their memory to learn the lessons and make sure that never happens again. And I'm confident that the inquiry has done a really thorough, important piece of work to make sure that happens, and that the government is taking this as seriously as it deserves.
Gavin Barwell, former Housing Minister and former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, thank you ever so much.
Pleasure, thank you.